Welcome to The Art of Conversation, a radio show dedicated to a college course, dedicated in turn to the art of conversation. This program is brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism at Commonwealth University here in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. I'm your host, Eric C. Miller, Professor of Communication Studies. This show is the official radio presence of Honors 211, The Art of Conversation, a course that focuses on the ancient art of dialectic. That is, the collaborative process by which knowledgeable peers pursue the truth through focused question and answer, back and forth, what is often called Socratic discussion. After a few weeks of wading through the theory on these matters, our students spend about 10 weeks in practice, holding twice weekly 75-minute deep dives into topics and questions of their choosing. Our theme this semester is the good life in the Great Acceleration, and all of our content falls somewhere within this intentionally wide umbrella. Each week, we're talking about how to live good lives in this era of soaring economic growth, technological innovation, labor market uncertainty, political turbulence, climate change, mass extinction, and on and on and on. My guest today is Chris, a student moderator who this week asked our class to think a little bit about the United Nations and whether or not the United States should remain a party to it. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Before we dive into our subject matter today, it's customary for our guest to tell us a little bit about himself. Where are you from? What is your major? What has sparked your interest in the UN?
I'm Chris. My major is in secondary education, focus in social studies. I'm from Easton, PA, right near the New Jersey border. And I guess what sparked my interest about the UN is sometimes when you're on the news, you might hear something about a conference going on or a peace talk going on about it. So I was just curious about any more general stuff that might be going on about it.
Now, before we got into our conversation in class yesterday, we surveyed the room to see what was their level of familiarity with the United Nations. And for as important and as prominent as the UN has been in the past 80 or so years, most people in the class didn't really know that much about it or have any strong opinions about it. Was that surprising to you?
Not really, because the United Nations, as of recent years, there hasn't been much big news about them, about anything much, so, as well as people not really watching news or paying attention to events like that much anymore, so it didn't really surprise me when people said that they just had a very general understanding of the UN.
Okay, so based on the possibility then that our listeners today might not know that much about the United Nations, can you give us a little bit of background? What is the UN? Where did it come from? Why does it exist?
Well, the United Nations was founded after the end of World War II, basically to prevent a World War III from starting. It was founded after the former League of Nations formed after World War I, but the United Nations focused more so on international relations and everything else more so than the League did. As of the Cold War years, that was their most predominant era. That's when they helped to vote for areas that might be invading. They helped to persuade them from leaving the nation or getting invaders out of their lands. And also they hold climate summits as well as other events to try and foster a world of unity and peace.
So for those who are interested in history, you could go back very far into global history and identify moments when balances of power existed here and there between nations, or before that, maybe between kingdoms, and wars were fought, violence occurred, but generally it was more localized. It's really only in the 20th century that nation states have the military capacity to wage truly global wars that encompass millions and millions of people, destroy infrastructure, cost a tremendous amount of money and a tremendous amount of lives lost, right? And so as you mentioned, after World War I, which was the world's greatest calamity to that point, Woodrow Wilson kind of led the way in founding the League of Nations. But then the United States, of course, was not a party to it because the Senate failed to ratify inclusion. It's only a couple decades later that we're involved in another massive global calamity, World War II, And after that, the United Nations is formed as a means to try and prevent it from happening again. And so far, though we have had a Cold War and a bunch of smaller hot wars around the globe, and we still have some going on today, we haven't been embroiled again in a truly world war. I mean, in your view, is that attributable to the United Nations? Did they keep us out of World War III? Did they play a role in it? Do you think it's attributable to other causes?
I would say that the UN played a role in preventing a World War III. Like you said, they had multiple conferences and other talks like that to try and persuade other nations from going throat to throat at each other. And I feel like they did foster some idea of no more massive world wars that'll cause millions to lose their lives.
And yet, the material that you shared with the class, the video and the articles, which I'll share in the show notes on YouTube, suggests that the United Nations is not what it was. In fact, the video that you shared with us from the Caspian Report suggests that the United Nations today is obsolete. Why might that be the case?
Well, that might be the case because as the years go on and more nations are slowly growing in strength, the UN grows bigger, and unfortunately with the growth of the UN, unfortunately starts the rise of power struggles. Currently in the UN, there are only, out of all the nations, there are 5 extremely predominant ones. Ones I can recall right now are the US, Russia, China, France, and I don't remember what the 5th was.
The UK.
The UK. But yeah, all these high, powerful nations stand higher amongst the other nations, and this fosters an idea of the strength of how much control a nation should have over the UN, because if anything was happening that involved U.S. involvement during a voting, the U.S. can say nay and veto any vote happening, and then just like that, it's gone.
Yeah, to me, that was the most interesting part of that video, is the way that it broke down the structure of the United Nations and explained, here is the General Assembly, here is the Security Council, here is this, that, and the other, the different branches and what they're supposed to do. Here's who the Secretary General is, and here's what his responsibilities are. I think for a lot of people who might have a vague understanding of what the United Nations is, they probably don't know the specifics of how it's actually structured, and I thought that was interesting. One of the key arguments made in the video is that the structure of the Security Council in particular is anachronistic in that it still reflects a world order from 1945, more so than from 2025. And so the 5 key members that you mentioned have that veto power over the UN in large part because they were the world's leading powers at the end of the Second World War, a time when the United States and the then USSR were actually allied in the fight against the Nazis, and so shared power after that war was over. But then, of course, in subsequent decades, a divide has formed, especially between the United States and the Russian Federation, with the People's Republic of China siding most often with Russia, and with France and the UK siding with the United States, and then with 188 other countries that are also a part of it, but don't have the same sort of influence that those 5 major players have. And so in my understanding of the video, the suggestion was that the current model is unfair because it gives those 5 nations too much power and the rest of the world not enough. Is that your understanding of the problem?
That's one of my understandings of the problem. Unfair control over who says what in the UN can lead to, like I said before, just snap of fingers saying no, and suddenly a problem is just brushed under the rug.
One of the challenges to fixing that problem, it seems to me, would be that those 5 key players don't really have any incentive to give up the power that they have. And if the remaining 188 players tried to press them to give up that power or voted to strip them of that power, then maybe they would end up just leaving the UN and so causing the whole thing to kind of crumble. Do you think that's a legitimate threat?
The threat of the UN crumbling in on top of itself.
Yeah, the threat that, like, if you did anything to reform the way it's currently structured, you might just knock out the key pillars and the whole thing comes collapsing down.
I feel like there's a small threat of that. Some nations might feel unfair towards it. But like I said before, the structure of the UN is very 1945 based, and there has to be some form of reform, even if not like the whole changing of veto power. There still has to be some form of something so that there's a fairer chance for other nations.
Now, one of the reasons I think that you had us consider this stuff is because you are interested in the possibility of the United States leaving the United Nations. In fact, one of the pieces of content that you shared with us in advance was a Donald Trump executive order about the UN. Can you sort of characterize for us the Trump administration's position on the UN as expressed in that order?
I feel like the President Trump's stance in the UN, like it said in the paper, was he feels unfair that America is paying so much money to the UN while other nations don't pay as much. I understand that some kids in the class, they were arguing that, well, America has the most money, so obviously they donate as much. But at the same time, that's not really a reason for America to donate still a massive amount. There still should be a form of like fair share within the UN instead of just America paying the higher percentage.
It occurred to me at several points in our conversation yesterday that we probably need to be somewhat hesitant to make big claims about this because so many people in the room admitted to having known nothing about the UN until we actually did this reading and watched this video and came to class to discuss it. I myself don't know enough about the UN and how it functions to have a really strong opinion about it one way or the other. But on this question of how much money gets allocated to the UN and the idea that the United States gives more than other nations, it seems somewhat reasonable to me, at least, that the United States would end up providing more funding to the UN in that it has such an enormous lion's share of the power. Or maybe those five key players in the Security Council might be on the hook for more funding because they are wealthy, powerful nations that exercise that veto power. Or maybe put another way, if we were to argue that the other nations should chip in more money and the United States less, would it then be reasonable to give those countries a greater share of power and cut some out from the United States and from the four others?
I feel like if you want to talk about like reforms for the UN, that may be like a small way to start. Just greater equality and control within the UN. Everyone having maybe not the same amount, but like a fairer amount of power of vetoing or yaying a vote, or everyone paying like a more similar amount of money.
Another question that I had going into this, having watched that video and seen the critique of the UN being made primarily from the perspective of smaller countries that don't have as much power as the key five, and then reading the executive order, which makes kind of the opposite argument that the United States pays too much for the return that it gets on its investment, I found that kind of confusing. If the United States decided to withdraw from the United Nations, the way it has already withdrawn from the UN Paris Climate Agreement, that has already withdrawn from the World Health Organization, what would that look like?
I feel like there would be a small bit of a power vacuum, I guess you would call it. There'd be a small bit of that with the other four nations trying to grab hold of the power the U.S. once had. America would be a bit more isolated, I guess, from the outside world, which is how the current administration wants to see America run, more isolated and nationalistic than part of the globalistic idea.
Given that so many of these other countries are complaining about the UN because it gives countries like the United States too much power, if the United States were then to just relinquish that power and just leave, would that give us more influence in the world order or less? It's not clear to me.
I feel like it would change from like America being a representative of the UN to America just being a representative of America. Like if they were to travel to a different nation, they probably wouldn't see them as another high member of the UN. They would just see them as member of an isolated nation just coming to them for a reason.
One question that we considered on this show a couple weeks ago when Tyler and Brandon were here was the extent to which the world has become globalized. And so diplomatic relationships, trade relationships, warfare are all occurring now in a really complex web of international connections. And I think it's interesting, the idea that the United States could withdraw from all of these international agreements, could withdraw perhaps from trade agreements by enforcing high tariffs on other countries that want to trade with us, seems to suggest that the United States can isolate itself from the rest of the world. And it's not entirely clear to me that we can do that or that it would be desirable to do that. I mean, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts on isolationism, well, it's a bit of a slippery slope if I had to be completely honest. We've made, like you said, so many deals and trades and such with other administrations. I feel like to completely oust ourselves from each one of them, maybe not all of them, maybe keep like a few, but for the basis of tariffs, that's an extremely complex area to go into because we tariff nations and other nations tariff us, so it would be a question of if we want to keep their nations tariffing us versus our nation tariffing them.
So if the options here before us are that the UN can be reformed to satisfy either the concerns of many of its smaller members or the concerns of specifically the Trump administration, what kind of a reform could be created to address those concerns and to save the United States from backing out and withdrawing from the UN entirely?
Are you asking how, if we should reform and how it can change us from leaving the UN?
I guess I'm curious if there's anything that can be done that would satisfy the concern raised by the Trump administration and maybe also stand a chance of reforming the UN in ways that other countries might appreciate as well.
Well, like I said, maybe other nations pay a bit more of like a fair share, maybe, but they try to share each other's like idea on how each nation should contribute to the UN. Maybe there should be like some form of I don't want to say reward, but some form of a return for investing as much into the UN as one nation is.
One of the issues that you raised in class the other day was that the United States no longer has the same sort of interest in UN participation because over the decades, the UN has suffered from a degree of mission drift, is the term that you used. Can you explain to us what you mean by that?
Originally, it was supposed to be just preventing another World War III, but as you are well aware, there's multiple proxy wars around the world, and not much the UN is doing about it. Fun fact, if you actually look up a video of one of the UN conferences back when Ukraine-Russia was starting to begin, there's a video of the Russian spokesperson going on and multiple other spokespersons from other nations just up and walked out of the room. So that raised like a very big concern to me of, do other nations really care about this idea of global peace, or are they more interested in promoting their own politics in the UN?
Well, let's talk about the Ukraine war then in particular. Russia is one of those five powers in the UN Security Council that has veto ability. And if they invade Ukraine and then the United Nations wants to do something about that and they are able to just exercise a veto, it seems like they are given a certain immunity to wage elective wars when and where they want. Is that the situation?
I feel like, yeah, Russia being one of the five members of the UN Security Council is a bit ironic, I guess. They promote peace, but at the same time, they're actively invading a nation. So I feel like for that, there has to be some form of a punishment because they're openly violating what the UN stands for, yet they still have the same veto power as they did if they would have never invaded.
The video that you share with us mentions Russia as an example of this, but also mentions the United States invading Iraq. back in 2003 and cites both the invasion of Ukraine and the invasion of Iraq as explicit violations of the UN codes, and suggests that because the US and Russia are on the Security Council with this veto power, that they're just too big for the UN to sort of rein in. I mean, if you think that Russia should be penalized for invading Ukraine, do you think the US should have been penalized for invading Iraq?
So I feel like there should have been some form of a punishment for that. So for any nation that decides to declare war when they're openly part of a peace council. So on the topic of the Iraq war, I want to say, yeah, there should have been some form of punishment.
I know that in the United States, just because I've done, quite a bit of reading and writing about the conservative movement in the U.S., that dating back to the 1960s and 50s, there have been a lot of groups like, the John Birch Society or the Concerned Women for America and others that have had planks in their platforms that called for the United States to leave the UN, all the way back to shortly after the United Nations was founded. And in large part, they said that they didn't like the idea that the U.S. was giving up its national sovereignty by agreeing to play a role in this international group. And the Iraq War seems to me an example of that. Like the United States wants to invade Iraq. The UN says, no, you can't do that. And the United States goes ahead and does it anyway. If the UN were to sanction the U.S. for that behavior, I think a lot of these folks who had been calling for the U.S. to leave all along would be up in arms saying, like, we're an independent country. You can't tell us what to do. You're obviously sympathetic to the idea that the U.S. should leave the UN. Are you drawing on that sort of theological perspective?
I feel like if we can't reform the UN, then what's the point in remaining in it? Other than this illusion of a free world where there's no wars. And I understand us staying just for like the single purpose of holding a higher veto power than other nations, but other than that, I don't really see any point in us remaining in it.
I guess, yeah, I came into this discussion, understanding that your position was that we should leave. And as I read these things and watched this video, I came away maybe thinking that being persuaded, first of all, that there are real problems with the UN, but then also feeling like the United States would be better off sticking it out and trying to reform the organization if at all possible, rather than, getting out entirely. I mean, if you were to make an elevator pitch, like a short argument as to why you think the United States should leave the UN, what would you say?
Well, I would say if the U.S. wants to try and persuade reformation in the UN, it would first take a lot more than the U.S. because there'll be other nations that say, no, we're perfect as we are. Other nations might say, I agree with some of your points, but not all of them. So I understand that the U.S. is one of the five heads, but at the same time, unless there's support from other heads or other nations for this idea of reformation, then I seriously doubt it's ever going to happen.
All right, Chris, thank you for joining us on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
This has been another edition of The Art of Conversation Radio, brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism at Commonwealth University in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. As always, I am your host, Eric C. Miller. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time.